My son drowned in the Skeena River 3 years ago, or so I believed. Every month since that phone call, I drove across Hamilton to my daughter-in-law's apartment on Barton Street East and handed her $700 in a plain white envelope. Money I scraped together between my Canada Post pension and whatever weekend jobs I could still manage at 63. I shoveled driveways in January. I painted garden sheds in July. I hauled furniture for people who posted ads on Kijiji, loading box springs into pickup trucks while my lower back filed its formal complaints. I did it for my granddaughter. I did it because my wife would have wanted me to. Then my upstairs neighbor knocked on my door on a Sunday afternoon in February, and the 4 words she said next split my life cleanly in two. Check the building camera. The building on Barton was a 4-story walk-up, the kind Hamilton has rows of near the old steelworks, red brick going orange with age, hallways smelling of damp carpet, and someone's cabbage soup. My daughter-in-law lived on the 3rd floor, 32 steps. I'd counted them on every visit for 3 years. I want to explain the $700 before I go any further, because the amount matters, and so does the reason. My son had borrowed money before the accident. Gambling debts, not from a bank, from the kind of people who collect in ways you don't want to know about. When he was gone, my daughter-in-law came to me with a folder of letters. Notices, some of them frightening. She had my granddaughter Chloe on her hip. Chloe was 5 years old and didn't understand why her father wasn't coming home from British Columbia. I'm not sure I fully understood it either. My daughter-in-law told me the total owed was $25,000. If I could cover $700 a month for 36 months, she could manage the rest. I agreed before I'd finished reading the letters, because Chloe was standing there in red socks and a shirt with a cartoon fox on it, and I would have agreed to anything. My wife found out 2 days later and didn't argue with me. She sat at the kitchen table very still for a while. "Just make sure you still see that little girl," she finally said. "Don't let the money become a reason to keep you at arm's length." She was right to worry about that, as it turned out. 8 months after my son's accident, my wife had a stroke in the upstairs hallway on a Wednesday morning. The doctors said it was the grief. She'd spent 40 years loving my son, his school concerts, his hockey tournaments, his bad decisions, all of it, and losing him had taken something structural out of her, something you can't identify on a scan but you can see in a person's eyes if you look. She survived the stroke, but never came all the way back. She passed the following April. I buried her in Woodland Cemetery on a cold morning, with the dogwood trees just starting to show color, and then I drove home and sat in our kitchen for 3 hours because I didn't know where else to go. After that, it was just me and the monthly drive to Barton Street. My daughter-in-law was not cruel. She wasn't warm, either. She answered the door with the chain on, took the envelope through the gap, said something that passed for a thank you. On good months, she'd let me stand in the hallway and call through to Chloe, who'd shout back about school or her hamster, named Maple or something a friend had said that was apparently hysterical if you were 8. On bad months, she said Chloe was sleeping. At 4:30 in the afternoon, I never pushed. I told myself I was being respectful of her grief. It was the 4th of February when I noticed something wrong. I'd come a day early because the 5th was a Sunday. I knocked, the chain slid across. Her hand came through the gap, same as always. But before I passed the envelope over, I heard a voice behind her. Low, comfortable. The voice of a man who felt entirely at ease in that room. Not the television. I'd spent enough years in a house to know the difference between a TV and a person breathing the same air as you. She must have seen something in my expression. "My cousin's visiting from Sudbury," she said. "Flat delivery, no pause." "I didn't know you had family in Sudbury," I said. She took the envelope. "Is that everything?" I drove home telling myself I'd been wrong. Cousins visited, men had voices. I was a widower looking for patterns in nothing. I made tea and listened to the radio and tried to settle back into the ordinary version of my life. I almost managed it. 15 days later, my neighbor Nola knocked on my door. Nola was 70 years old, had lived in the building for 12 years, and was the sort of person who chose her words before she spent them. She stood in my doorway with her cardigan pulled tight and spoke quietly, aware of thin walls. "I don't want to cause trouble," she said. I told her she wasn't causing anything. I've been seeing a man come up the back stairwell late at night, she said, once or twice a month, always past midnight. He goes to her door and lets himself in. He has a key. I've seen it 3 times now. She looked at me directly. The other night the hallway light caught his arm when he reached up for the lock. He was wearing a short-sleeved shirt. He had a tattoo on his left forearm, a large eagle, wings spread, beak facing left. I had to hold the door frame. My son got that tattoo at 22, the summer he came back from Army Reserve training in Petawawa. A bald eagle, very detailed with the beak angled to the left. He'd made a point of the direction, told me it meant something. I had given him grief about it for years. I would know it from across a parking lot in the dark. "You're certain it was an eagle?" I said. "I taught visual arts for 28 years, Nola said. "I know what an eagle looks like." I called Maurice that evening. Maurice and I had gone to Westdale Secondary together when the school still had a working furnace, and we'd stayed in each other's orbits through marriages and funerals and the slow passage of 6 decades. He'd spent 23 years as a detective with the OPP before his hip forced him into retirement. He was the sharpest person I knew and owed me approximately nothing, which is exactly why I knew he'd help without asking for anything back. I explained everything. He listened without interrupting. "Give me until the end of the week," he said. "Building management installed cameras last year. I know the company that maintains them. I'll see what I can pull." Maurice called Thursday afternoon. "Come for coffee. Bring your appetite, because this is going to be heavy." He had the footage on his laptop at his kitchen table, 3 months' worth, back stairwell camera, the landing outside my daughter-in-law's door. We watched the November footage first. Timestamp, 1:52 a.m., the morning of the 6th, the night after I'd made my payment. A man came up the stairs from below, moving quietly, head down, hoodie on but hood back. When he reached the landing and stretched his arm up to the lock, the camera caught his left forearm in the overhead light. The eagle, wings open, beak to the left. "That's my son," I said. Maurice said nothing. He pulled up October. Same man, same forearm, same time of night. September, August. Every month, reliably, the night after I delivered $700 in a white envelope, this man appeared in that stairwell with a key and walked through a door like he'd never left. We watched it 6 times. Then Maurice closed the laptop, and we sat in his kitchen listening to the fridge hum. "The company that notified you," Maurice said. "Northland Timber Solutions. Did you ever verify it?" I had not. The man who came to my door 3 years ago had a suit and a briefcase and condolences ready, and papers that looked official. My wife had just stopped eating. I was not verifying anything. I was signing things and accepting things because someone in a suit was telling me what the next steps were, and in that state, you follow the next steps. Maurice looked up Northland Timber Solutions the next morning. The letterhead address was a private mailbox service near Prince George. The company registration had been filed in Ontario 16 months before my son's supposed accident and listed a numbered corporation as the sole director. It was a shell, built by someone who understood how documentation works and how long grief buys you before anyone looks carefully. I thought of the box of personal effects that had arrived in the weeks after, his wallet, his work gloves, a watch I'd given him for his 30th birthday, and the signet ring, my father's ring, which I'd given my son when he turned 25, a Celtic knot on a silver band, with a small, worn nick on the inner edge where he'd caught it on a car door handle one afternoon in our driveway. I'd held that ring when it arrived and cried for most of an hour. Maurice asked if we could examine it. I brought the box over. We put the ring under a desk lamp, and Maurice used a jeweler's loop he kept in a kitchen drawer from his detective days. He took his time. "Silver-plated zinc alloy," he said. "It's a replica. Someone made a very careful copy and distressed the nick on the inside. Look at the edge here. It's been stamped in rather than worn in. This was manufactured to look like the original. My father's real ring, the actual one, still on my son's finger somewhere." I sat with that for a long moment. "He's been alive this entire time." Maurice nodded. "He let his mother grieve herself into a stroke." There was nothing to say to that. Maurice knew it, and so did I. Over the next 3 days, we followed the money. Maurice had a banking contact. I won't say more than that. What we found was precise and methodical. My $700 arrived in my daughter-in-law's RBC account and was transferred out within 48 hours to a numbered business account registered in Ontario. From there, it sat briefly, before moving to a joint personal account held under two names, my daughter-in-law's name and her brother's. Her brother was 35 and had worked in insurance in Brampton before relocating to Hamilton about 2 years back. Maurice started watching him on a Thursday. By Thursday evening, we had photographs. My daughter-in-law and her brother at a Tim Hortons on King Street West. Their body language was not the body language of people who share a mother. He touched her hand across the table. When they walked out, he put his hand on the small of her back. I had to pull over on the way home and sit with the engine running for a while. It took me until morning to accept the full shape of what I was looking at. My son had faked his death, to run from dangerous people, to disappear, for reasons I still didn't entirely understand. But while he was hiding, the woman he'd married and her brother had been quietly constructing their own exit. My $700 combined with money my son had apparently been sending his wife from wherever he was hiding had been flowing steadily into a joint account that neither of them had any intention of spending in Ontario. Maurice pulled the balance, $83,000, accumulated over 3 years. There were flights booked, Toronto Pearson to Cancun, in 9 days, one way, 2 passengers. No ticket for Chloe. I looked at that itinerary for a long time. Chloe was 8 years old. Her father had vanished when she was 5. Her mother was planning to board a plane and leave her behind. Maurice found the address within the week. My son was renting a bungalow in Brantford, 45 minutes from Hamilton, month to month, under a name that was close enough to his real name to pass a casual look, but different enough to avoid turning up in a straightforward search. He'd kept his old pickup truck. I don't know why that detail hit me so hard, some stubborn familiar thing he hadn't been able to let go of. We drove out on a Saturday afternoon. Maurice stayed by the car. I walked to the door alone. My son answered in a flannel shirt and socks. He was thinner than I remembered, older in the face, with his hair grown out the way he'd never worn it. He had the expression of a man who answered doors, wondering every time if this was the one he'd been dreading. He said my name very quietly, just once. I told him his mother was gone. He'd heard, through whatever channels exist for people living the way he was living. But hearing and sitting with it are different things. I made him sit with it. I told him what the 8 months looked like, the weight she lost, the way she stopped sleeping, how I'd find her at the kitchen table at 3 in the morning staring at nothing, because the silence in the house had become impossible. I told him that she had died, believing her son had drowned in a river in British Columbia, that she had spent her last months loving a man she thought was dead, and that the last clear thing she said was to tell him she forgave him, because even at the end she didn't know there was nothing to forgive, because the lie had held. He didn't speak for a long time. His hands were pressed flat on his thighs. Then he talked. He'd borrowed more than I knew. The gambling had gone on for years before I understood the scale of it. When the people he owed money to started making specific kinds of threats, the kind that mention addresses and names of family members, he'd panicked and found someone who knew how to build a paper trail for a disappearance. He'd told his wife the minimum necessary, that he was alive, that he needed her to maintain the story, that she'd get money from him regularly and should ask me for a modest contribution toward expenses. He'd told her to ask for $500. She told me $700, I said. He blinked. She's been receiving $700 from me every month for 3 years and routing most of it into a joint account with her brother. I took out the bank records Maurice had printed and handed them across. Look at the balance. He read it slowly, then he read it again. I showed him the flight itinerary, 2 passengers, one way. His face changed in a way that was painful to watch. Not because I felt sorry for him, not entirely, but because it was my son's face and I'd been looking at it for 40 years. He'd understood, as I laid it out, that he had spent 3 years hiding and grieving and waiting while the woman he trusted to hold his life together had been slowly and carefully dismantling everything and packing it into an offshore adjacent account with her brother. He'd been their mechanism, their cover story. The reason there was money to skim it all. She's leaving, Chloe, I said. That was when something shifted in him for good. He said he'd do whatever was needed. No negotiation, no asking what the offer was first. I think he understood that he had used up any leverage he might once have had, and that the only decent move remaining was to stop making everything worse. We spent 4 days preparing. Maurice coordinated with the RCMP through a contact in Hamilton Division. The fraud case was relatively clean. Falsified death documentation, misappropriated funds, conspiracy. My son met with investigators on a Tuesday and gave them everything: account numbers, his wife's communication with her brother, dates, amounts, the full timeline. In return, the RCMP would consider his cooperation when the time came for his own charges. He would still face charges. We were very clear about that, and he accepted it. The flight was on a Thursday. I drove to Pearson with Maurice. We parked on level P3 and were inside the terminal by 7:15. I ordered a coffee from a kiosk near the Air Canada counter and held it without drinking it. My daughter-in-law and her brother came through the departures entrance at 8:20. They had matching hard-sided luggage, new coats. She was laughing at something he'd said. The RCMP officers moved in when they reached the bag drop queue. 2 plainclothes officers from the front, 2 uniformed from behind. My daughter-in-law saw them coming and went completely still. Her brother tried to pivot and walk away and made it 4 steps before a uniformed officer said, calmly and clearly, "Sir, stop where you are." She turned when they put her hands behind her back. Somehow, across a terminal full of people, she found my face. I don't know how. There were hundreds of travelers around us, families with strollers, business people with roller bags, the full noise and motion of an international airport on a Thursday morning. She found me anyway. I looked back at her without moving. They were in custody in under 5 minutes. Maurice and I drove back to Hamilton in the gray February light without saying much. There wasn't much left to say. We'd followed everything to its end. Chloe had been staying with her aunt, my daughter-in-law's older sister, who'd been told enough to agree to take her, and who'd been, in my experience of her, the most decent person in that particular family. Chloe knew something had happened. She was 8 and observant, and not the kind of child who could be entirely shielded from the weather of adult situations. I went to see her that Saturday. She was sitting on her aunt's front steps with a drawing pad, which she'd always done when she was working through something she couldn't quite articulate. She ran to me before I'd gotten the gate fully open. I held on for a long time. She asked me where her mum was. I told her that her mum had made some choices that weren't right, and that adults who make certain kinds of wrong choices have to go somewhere and reckon with them. It wasn't the complete truth. It was as much of the truth as an 8-year-old needed in that particular moment, on that particular Saturday, on her aunt's front steps in February. She pressed her face against my jacket and breathed slowly. Then she said, "Is my dad in heaven?" I looked at the top of her head. That question had been waiting 3 years to land on me exactly like that. "Your dad made some serious mistakes," I said, "but he's alive, and he's working on making things right." She pulled back and studied me with the particular focus she had. She'd always had it, since she was tiny, this way of looking at you like she was reading something behind your face. "Is he actually alive?" "He's actually alive," I said. She sat with that for a while. Then she said, "Can I still be sad about stuff?" I told her she could be sad about anything she wanted, for as long as she needed, and that none of it would change a single thing between the two of us. She nodded once, the way she did when something was settled, and went back to her drawing. The trial ran 7 months. My daughter-in-law was convicted on fraud, conspiracy, and a charge related to child abandonment, that last one carrying a weight in the courtroom that seemed to settle into the air and stay there. Her brother was convicted on fraud and conspiracy. My son pleaded guilty to his charges and received a sentence that the judge specifically noted reflected his cooperation with investigators. 2 years less a day, to be served in the community under strict conditions. He gave a statement before sentencing. I was in the room. I won't repeat what he said, but I will say that he looked at the judge and not at the floor, and that he said what he meant without qualifying it. The court ordered full restitution. I received a check for $25,200. 36 months of payments plus interest returned. I put $15,000 into an RESIC for Chloe, a registered education savings plan, so the government adds to it, and it compounds by the time she's ready for whatever comes after high school. I used the rest on the house, the hot water heater that had been making alarming sounds for 2 winters, the front walkway that had heaved and cracked, and 3 years of deferred repairs I hadn't had money or energy to address. My son and I speak on Sunday evenings. It is not easy conversation. Some weeks after 5 minutes we've said what we have to say, and we just stay on the line in quiet until one of us finds another thread. He asks about Chloe every time without exception. He's not permitted contact with her yet. There are conditions on his sentence and agreements we've made privately. But she knows he's working on making things right. And she's decided, with the particular gravity of an 8-year-old who has thought it over carefully, to let that be enough for now. The replica ring, the fake one they put in the box of personal effects, I dropped into a stream in the Dundas Valley on a walk last October. The real one, my father's, Celtic knot, the worn nick on the inner edge, arrived back to me in a Canada Post mailer the week after my son entered his plea. He'd worn it the whole 3 years. I put it back in the drawer where my father used to keep it. Maybe someday it goes to Chloe. Last Tuesday, I picked her up from school, and we stopped at Tim Hortons on the way home. She got a hot chocolate and a Timbiebs box, and deliberated over the Timbits, with the focus of someone making choices that cannot be undone. I got a medium double-double and watched her deliberate. "Grandpa," she said, when she'd made her final selections and settled back against the booth. "Yeah. I'm glad you never stopped coming to visit, even when Mum said I was sleeping." She went back to her hot chocolate, as if she hadn't just taken the breath right out of me. I looked out the window at the February Street, people going past in their coats, a city bus pulling away from the stop across the road, a thin snow starting to fall the way it does in Hamilton in February, not committing to anything, just present. I thought about my wife sitting at the kitchen table. I thought about 32 steps and a chain-locked door. I thought about an eagle with its beak turned to the left, caught in a hallway camera at 1:52 in the morning. "I'll always come," I said. "That's never been something that was going to change." Chloe nodded, satisfied with that answer, and reached into the Timbits box. I have learned, in the 3 years since a man in a suit knocked on my door, with a folder of official-looking papers and a practiced expression of condolence, that grief is the most reliable tool people use against you. Those who intend to take from you understand that a person in mourning will not check the registration address on a company letterhead, will not ask to see a coroner's report filed with the actual province, will not open a ring box and look at the metal under a loupe. They know that love makes you want to believe, and that belief in the middle of grief is almost impossible to interrupt. I trusted without verifying. I should have asked harder questions. I should have made one phone call to the BC coroner's office, one email to the supposed employer, one conversation with someone who wasn't already invested in my believing what they were telling me. I didn't, because I was 60 years old, and my wife was coming apart in the room behind me, and a man in a suit was telling me what the next steps were, and in that state you follow the next steps. I don't carry the blame for being human. But I tell you this because the people who used my grief against me were counting on exactly that humanity, on me being too broken, too loyal, too careful of others' feelings to look too closely at the seams. Look at the seams, even when it costs you something, especially then. Chloe wants to learn carpentry. She watched something online about dovetailed joints and came to me about it with the kind of focused interest she reserves for things she's already decided. I told her we'd get a beginner's kit and work in the garage on weekends. She said we should build a bookshelf first, because she has a great many books and not enough places to put them. I said that sounded like exactly the right place to start.